Welcome to the second tutorial for ENVM3104 for summer semester 2019. So in this tute we're going to run through the 2018 exam, and we won't take as long as we took last week, but I thought it was still useful to start with a recap on what the exam information is, but not to go back over it in the same detail that we did last week. So as you know, on the Blackboard site, in the essay tab, you can find the exam information sheet. You know that the exam consists of, it's 2 hours long, 3 parts. I made a minor change to the one that I gave you last week, in that the question that I've given you for part A, I said last week that it was question 3 on the exam, and I just changed the order to make the pages fit better. So it's a question. It's not question 3 though, I think it's question 2. It doesn't matter, it's not substantive. But so you know that you can take in 2 pages of notes, anything on those 2 pages, double-sided A4, colour, typed, handwritten, whatever you want, any size, any font. So part A has just got some short answer questions like this. And did anyone think about this question and want to hit me with why you think, you know, what your answer is for this question? Because I gave it to you, and I've said it in the exam information. I'm telling you this question because I want you to think about it carefully before the pressure of the exam, because I really want you to lock down this. If you remember one thing about climate, the climate regime, to me this is the central misconception that absolutely bedevils, you know, policy progress in it, because people think that 1 degree or 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees sounds small, and they think that, well, that's no big deal. So why is that wrong? So I've said it's a misconception. Why is it wrong? Yep.
I looked at my notes for this one, but it's to do with the shifting extremes.
Yes.
So those highest extremes, basically, it's like bodies and us, the system kind of breaks down.
Yes. That's a great answer. And what diagram do you think of? So it says, use a diagram that assists your answer. That's a really big hint that there's a diagram I'm looking for. Yep. And yeah, there's 2 bell curves, and you start off with a normal distribution of temperature, and then if you shift that across, it's the shift in the mean. The big thing to get across is that you've shifted the entire fucking distribution, and that's what's driving the bushfires now, like drying, and it's the shift in the tail that the whole distribution has shifted, and it's the extremes that are the killers. So just like, you know, last year was the hottest year on record, but people didn't really notice that until November. Like if you've increased the maximum temperature in winter, it doesn't seem like a big deal, because, you know, instead of being 15 degrees, it's 18 degrees, and you just think, oh, well, it's a little bit warmer, it's a warm winter. I know at home we, didn't use our fireplace. We've got a wood cooker. We didn't use it. But when that built up over the entire year, and with the lowest recorded rainfall on record, that meant that there were these tinderbox conditions throughout large swathes of Australia. So then when it came to November, or October, November, December, and the extremes hit, we had this situation that was just primed, a tinderbox ready, like an explosive ready to go off, and we know it did go off. And I mean, those images of people huddled on the beach on New Year's Day, you know, with that red eerie glow, and like Australia, I just remember looking at it just thinking, holy mackerel, this looks like some, something out of a movie. But this is Australia on New Year's Day. Like, people are meant to be like at the beach enjoying themselves, and here they are basically huddled on a beach for survival. Like, in so many people. It was just incredible. But it's that, we're at 1 degree warming now, and we're getting these impacts. So it's enormous. To me, that this is just such an important concept. And it's central to why, the federal government can sort of have this blasé attitude to our Paris targets. But they ignore that this is a radical change in the entire system. 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is not a small change. It is a massive, enormous change. And that has consequences through, and will have huge consequences for your careers. So, yeah. So, really emphasise that question, really important. So for, climate change, if you leave this course remembering, 1.5 and 2 degrees, the Paris Agreement, UNFCCC, a little bit about, carbon dioxide equivalence is how we account for greenhouse gas emissions, and then the fact that there's this shift and that's the big deal, then really I would just be ecstatic if you took that away from the course. Because, yeah, those are, to me, the cores. So, treaty interpretation too. There is a bit of treaty interpretation in one of the questions, but I emphasised last week it's simple. I give you the bit of the treaty and I'm really looking for you to apply the principles. So that's part A. Then part B is, just some longer essay questions. Let's move on to the exam, and practice that. And then part C, the essay question, and as I emphasised last week, when we look at the marking scheme, you can get half of the marks really easily in just essentially describing what we've covered in the course content. If you show me that you remember something, substantial part of it, you'll get half the marks. So that question's worth 12 marks. If you just gave me essentially a couple of pages with the list of headings in order of the major treaties and show that you understand a little bit about them, you can at least scrape 5 or 6 out of 12 for that. Yep. Yes.
Do we have to speak for everyone that you spoke about in the lectures, or just the major ones?
So like in some areas, like on trade, I mentioned, maybe half a dozen other treaties like TRIPS and the range. So if there were just minor subsidiary ones that I just mentioned, I wouldn't worry. But essentially, like, you could start with like the course lecture topics. Not that.
Things like Agenda 21 and then the UN Sustainable Development Goals and stuff like that, because they were pretty big topics with our treaties. So.
Yeah, you can mention them. So like that lecture outline, could be a good start for your list of headings. List of headings, but the treaties they're the big ones, so if it was mentioned there, then I'd mention them, because those are the sorts of things that I'm looking for.
Do you want us to explain details about each?
It's that how long is
it? Very long.
Yeah, so it's that how long is a piece of string question. So I know you've got half an hour to do it, but I also know you go in with me having given you the question, and the fact that, like, it's not like I'm just springing on this on you in the exam. So I'm expecting a well-written essay that deals with these and says something about each. So I would plan, and you should practice.
I did plan and start planning yesterday, and it was very long. I think that's 700 words, and I'm up to 1959.
Yeah, and you'll find that you can't literally write it out in half an hour. So. So the main things I emphasised last week were make sure you have some headings and have structure, and then pretty well, plan to have a paragraph on each treaty, but a paragraph by paragraph, I don't mean half a page, World Heritage Convention might be, the World Heritage Convention agreed in 1972, is a cornerstone of the modern international system. Properties can be entered on the World Heritage List, and there are just a few lines in it. Yep.
For each treaty, would it be important to say how many parties to it?
No, don't worry about. So what I'm really, if you think about it from the perspective of what I'm looking for, this question is, to me, it's, covers the whole course, but to me, it's about helping you remember the major bits. So all I really want you to be able to do is identify the treaties, something about, what they cover, and then move on. Don't worry about the details. Like, I don't need to hear what Article 4 of the World Heritage Convention says, or, any details more than, there's a World Heritage list or the like. You don't have to go into, like, so let's just say on the World Heritage Convention, you wouldn't have to go into, for instance, talking about, I talked in the lecture about how in 2012 Australia faced the threat of having the Great Barrier Reef placed on the World Heritage in Danger list, and it was this big wake-up call, and I talked about that, but that was really just fleshing out some issues. You wouldn't talk about that in the essay because you just won't have time.
So what the treaty is, why they were treated and what they cover, you don't really need to go.
No.
Sort of why it is important.
So what I really want you to show me is just you have some understanding of each of the treaties, and so I'd suggest just have a little paragraph, maybe break it into the context that we've got these 4 periods. So have a little paragraph summarising 1945 to 1960 was a period of post-World War II rebuilding, concern for the environment was low, and few treaties were created, but it's still there's still some important parts. And then the UN Charter, so there's a heading. Sorry, there's a heading is 1945 to 1960, and then a little paragraph on it, might be 3 or 4 lines, and then line break, new heading, UN Charter, line break, the UN Charter is blah blah blah, 2 lines maybe. So just you can quickly come up with 3 or 4 pages or the like. You quickly come up with 3 or 4 pages, but there'll be a lot of gaps in them. But you don't like bunch it all up on one page, with no breaks. Just cool. And then the thing that I emphasised as well was that final sentence, that spend some time at the end, because most of it will just be descriptive. Like most of your essay will just be describing the things we've covered in the lecture. And as I talked about last week, the marking criteria are based around, it's easy to get half the marks for pretty well describing what we've covered and showing that you are aware of them. But then the top few marks are for showing some critical analysis and insight into it. So that final sentence is a real opportunity for you to show, that you can show originality, insight, those sorts of things, and allows me to go, okay, well, this is a really good essay, well structured, covered the content well, 9 or 10 out of 12, and then reading that final section going, yeah, this person really understands, and showing real insight, 11 out of 12 or 12 out of 12. I'm really looking to give you marks, so don't, and this is just an opportunity to pick up some good marks, but also hopefully, one of the reasons for giving you this essay and telling you what it is and helping you prepare is hopefully you'll be able to remember key parts of the overall system and the evolving story. So for your jobs in the future, you've got core parts of the international framework sort of locked away. Because as I've emphasised, I know that most of the details you'll just forget, and that's just the reality. Cool. Okay, so that's that essay. Any questions? Okay, let's go then to the last year's exam and work through it. Okay, so your exam this year will look exactly like this, except it'll say 2019 at the top and in the middle. But other than that, the first page will look exactly the same. So last year, let's just go through them you can, as I said last week, I think, you can do it in any order. So you might want to do the essay first. I really suggest you stick to time limits, that you know, there's a certain number of marks for each question. Stick to your time limits. Don't spend ages on, for instance, one of the short answer questions because there's only so many marks. Similarly with the essay question, spend half an hour on it, but don't spend an hour because there's only so many marks I can give you for it, and if you leave other questions blank because you didn't get to them, then I can't give you marks for that. So whichever way you do it, stick to the time limits. Okay, so Part A. On 10 May 2018, the UN General Assembly resolved to establish a process to assess possible gaps in international environmental law and environmentally related instruments with a view to strengthening their implementation through a new Global Pact for the Environment, GPE. Explain the normal process for creating and administering international treaties, such as the proposed GPE. Use a diagram to assist your explanation, but supplement it by explaining and writing the steps involved. So I really like, and I try to make all of the questions as much as possible current. So the GPE is a real process that the UN was developing. So a lot of the questions draw on facts that are relevant at the time. And similarly this year, you'll find that there's, you'll see a question related to, bushfires, for instance. So I try and make it current. At the same time, I need to balance not making it too wordy because this is only a short answer question, so I don't want to give you an essay to read, particularly for students who are working in a second language. So try and keep it short. But if you look at this question, the second paragraph could have been the question. The first paragraph is there. Why do you think? Yeah, a bit of context makes it current, makes it relevant, makes it more interesting. Can you use it in any way in your answer? So the actual question could just be the second paragraph, but if you think about the marking criteria, you get core marks for basically describing getting the answer right and depth of answer, but remember that you can always get analysis, even if it doesn't specifically say critically analyse it. So if possible, if you've got any facts, if you can weave them into your answer, great. If the question doesn't require it, you don't have to, but look for opportunities to show that you're a thinker, that you can show insight into it. Yep. Yep.
And that would be something like the environmental catastrophe.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's just look at it. So in answering this, let's just look at the second question. Let's come back to the facts. But yeah, let's explain the normal process for creating and administering international treaties such as the proposed GPE. Use a diagram to assist your explanation. So what diagram are we thinking of? Yep, so it's that one that... Slides. This one. So, yeah, you'd want to, and that diagram might be something well worth putting in your 2 pages of notes. So it's there. You've got 8 minutes, so you could, you can put this down, but also, put a few paragraphs in to explain it, and I'm looking to give you marks, so weave it in. So yeah, you could start with that. This is the typical process begins with countries identifying a common problem that they need to work together to solve. Typical process is shown in the following figure, and you can just set out this and oops. So explain the normal process for creating and administering international treaties. How can we weave in the facts?
So you can talk about some of the stuff that's currently going on, the scale of problems, the fact that they are international nature, things like the climate change has had a role in Australia
Yep.
feeling bushfire.
Are there any areas where there's an obvious gap that we talked about? Yep. Yes, that's a great one. So the high seas is an area where, and that one's, you don't have to get into any real politics. It's just widely acknowledged that the high seas is a hugely problematic area. But, there's plenty of other areas. What's another gap? Something that we only mentioned, I think, way back in lecture 1, but is a huge issue for environment generally, but is virtually impossible to population growth. Yeah, is a topic that there's no international treaties on, is a huge driver for all of the impacts we're facing, and yet, there'll never be a treaty on it. No way. Yes?
Just a side note, could you talk about how there's no treaty for population growth in question 8? Well, not really.
Yeah, you could. So in terms of what's going to happen in the future, you could talk about population growth. But what would you, to show insight into that, what would be the sort of thing you might say? So what are the prospects of
Population growth.
Yeah, for dealing with population growth? Well, you know our culture, like the international culture. Why don't we deal with population growth?
It's too difficult.
Look at the abortion debate. I mean, that's hard enough. There's these religious elements, you go to the US and that's just insane. And that's the irony in the US, they've got this massive, anti-abortion movement, about, no child. As soon as, an egg is fertilized, it's, life, and, you can't possibly have an abortion. And yet, people who are actually alive, they're, stopping at the border, like a, 10-year-old kid who doesn't have parents. No, you can't come into our country. Go back, to the war-ravaged, country that you came from, and, where, death rates are, 40% or something, or, zero employment, So there's this weird debate where there's this absolute focus on, anti-abortion, and yet it often goes hand in hand with the anti-immigration debate. Anyway, what's the one thing we've got to deal with? What's the best tool that we've got to deal with population growth? Yep. Yeah, so women's education is one of the major tools that we have for that is relatively politically acceptable. I say relatively because you might think that that's just an obvious thing that is Saudi Arabia, where women are oppressed, and particularly in Afghanistan, where the Taliban were basically, killing anyone that was, women's education is seen as a complete anathema, that, they shouldn't be educated. So, lots of stuff there about control. So, if you could weave in something to that, you don't have to answer the question, but, bring in a few lines. If you can see an obvious thing for tying in the facts to your answer, then bring it in. Cool? Okay. Everyone happy with that? So core marks there. In terms of 3 marks, you can easily get 2 marks out of 3 for just reproducing the diagram. So there's nothing hard there. And then the depth of your answer and maybe bringing in some insight gets you the extra mark. Okay. In 2020, question 2, in 2020 you're working for your national government in the preparatory meetings for a proposed new treaty for the Global Pact for the Environment. The delegation will be led by a new minister. You're asked to prepare a briefing note for the minister explaining some basic issues for negotiations. Explain the following issues for the minister. What is the role and importance of voting blocks in international negotiations, and identify any 3 recognised voting blocks in international negotiations, and broadly explain which countries are members of them. I think we covered this last week. I often put in a question like this, because it's it's a sort of central issue for a lot of negotiations, are voting blocks. So what are voting blocks? We talked about it, I think, last week, and there was a slide with, the major voting blocks summarised in a couple of the lectures. So what are voting blocks? We're summarising for the Minister. Yep.
The groups of nations that have similar interests or share some kind of common goal.
Yep.
That vote together on issues.
Yep. They agree to work together, negotiate and vote together. Yeah. So what are some of the major ones? Yes. And what does it comprise?
So it's developing nations and China.
Yes.
About 130,
Yep.
135
Mm-hmm.
now. It's a really diverse group, but they're more focused on poverty alleviation.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're a little bit divided on climate policy.
Yep. Yep. So, So some other big voting blocks. Sorry.
ASS,
Yep. So AOSIS is
the Small Island Nation.
yep Alliance of Small Island States, and it's been yep.
They're really vulnerable to sea level rise,
Yep.
particularly. So they're really big. They've really come together on the climate change
Mhm.
issue. They've really been pushing for the 1.5 or lower.
Yep.
So they've been really strong in getting those targets to the Paris Agreement,
Mm-hmm.
making the rest of us very embarrassed about it.
Okay. Another group.
Is there an Africa?
Sorry.
Is there an African?
Yes, there is an African group, and what's it made up of?
African countries?
Yep. Could have had, someone from Russia. No, I'm geographically embarrassed. No. So the African group, and they obviously, they vote together, they see common interests. Also, obviously, African culture is very diverse, but they do, there's also a lot of synergies. So, there's the African group. So that's three. Is it three? Yeah, we've got three. What are, there's another big one. EU, easy one. So, so the role, they work together. I particularly emphasise one thing in lectures about voting blocks for why they're so valuable, particularly for small countries, and why is that?
So they can get to all the meetings.
Yeah, so often there's lots of side meetings at different, major conferences. So if you've just got one delegate there, as a lot of small countries have great difficulty sending anyone because they're in poverty, and so having other countries that can, you're voting with and can go to the many meetings is just a practical reality. So the G77 and China is particularly important. The richer countries like Australia or the US will go with a delegation of 100 or more, and so they don't need really to be part of a voting bloc, but they do it often just to essentially collaborate and build power. But they don't so much need the logistical assistance. Okay, so any questions on that? Yeah, we haven't really. Is there any way you can bring in the facts? So it's a global pact for the environment. Can you bring in the facts at all? Probably I haven't given you enough in that question because in the last one I'd told about possible gaps, whereas this one I haven't really explained what it is. Global pact for the environment. I must admit, I wasn't, when I was writing that question, I wasn't really thinking of looking for people to weave it in. But if you could find someone to weave it in, all well and good. Emphasising the G77, and it's important. It's a really important aspect for the whole UN system.
Question. You have 3 marks.
Yes.
The marks that we separated pretty straightforward. 1 mark for what's the role, 1 mark for the importance, 1 mark for the symmetry.
It would be nice to say that, and I often see other lecturers give, particularly when they get other people to mark it, they'll often have like a rubric where they basically get 1 mark for, a particular point. I don't do that, because I mark them all myself, and often answers are a bit like a Rubik's Cube. I can see what the student is getting at, but it mightn't be exactly what we covered, but I can see where they're coming from, and it isn't quite right, but I can see what they mean. So I don't basically work on a 1, 2, 3 system typically, and I'm really looking to apply the criteria, like basically 1.5 marks if you can show me that you understand something about voting blocks. And if someone was to, give a basic explanation about voting blocks and then put G77 in China, G77 in China, EU, AOSIS, just the acronym, then there's the bare bones there of the answer, but it's nothing more than that. They haven't really explained, they haven't really gone into any further depth, but they've shown that they at least have an adequate understanding. So does that sound okay? So it's not a straightforward 1, 2, 3. And I am looking for, there's many ways that people can show critical analysis and insight. So, cool. Okay. 3, the governments of Japan, China have a long-running dispute over sovereignty of islands lying between their countries. A, how can international disputes such as this be resolved? B, identify any major international institutions that may be involved in resolving such disputes and their role. So 3 marks. So I haven't told you we talked about it. They're the Senkaku Islands. I don't particularly, want you, not looking for that particularly in the answer. Japan's actually got quite a few territorial disputes, and obviously China has a whole heap. So Japan has the Senkaku Islands. They also have a dispute with Russia over some islands lying to their north, which Russia kept after the end of World War II. They were Japanese, so they've got all this Japanese culture, but yeah, the USSR kept them at the end of World War II, and Japan is understandably aggrieved. So how might international disputes like this be resolved? So again, I'm looking for adequate understanding and then also showing insight.
So treaties usually will have provisions in there for resolving disputes.
Yes.
That would be things like the International Court of Justice, or arbitration.
Yep. So they probably back up here. You can think of peaceful means, and then you can also think of non-peaceful means. So in terms of peaceful means, they could enter into a treaty. There's nothing here about there being a treaty, and typically there aren't treaties established, like there's no treaty itself recognising, like establishing Japan as a international entity and where its territorial boundaries are. It's what constitutes Japan and what constitutes China are essentially the result of history and the established customary international law around sovereignty. So particularly effective occupation is one of the core concepts when we talked about sovereignty. You don't need to go into the background. I talked about the Senkaku Islands, that essentially they're just off the coast of China. So China essentially, China's fishing people would have used them historically, but then when Japan rose to be a naval power in the sort of 1890s, when it sort of came out of its self-imposed isolation, and the US sailed a fleet into harbour and basically demanded that Japan open itself up to trade, and then the emperor of the time went into essentially full-blown modernisation, and then Japan rose to be its major military power. And ironically, if you ever go to Western Australia, there's a little port near Albany at the bottom of WA where the fleet that was going to take the Australians over in World War I to the Middle East, and then ultimately where they went to Gallipoli, they all assembled in this beautiful port, and they were met there and escorted across by 2 Japanese destroyers, escorted the Australian soldiers across to fight in World War I. Obviously, a lot had changed in World War II. But Japan was this major military power in the 1890s, and it effectively annexed or took over these islands by force. and the islands were then controlled by Japan until it lost World War II. The US recognised the Senkaku Islands as being part of Japan. So there is actually a treaty. The peace treaty actually recognises the islands as being part of, but China doesn't recognise that. So, and modern China, modern China, look for the right words. China, there was the Chinese Civil War, 1946 to 1949, wasn't it? Or 47 to 49, where the government of China was overthrown and the Communist Party rose to power. So the peace treaty was in 1946. So the modern government doesn't recognise it. So there is a treaty, but it's not between China and Japan about these islands. So you could resolve it by an international... This is a dispute that you could resolve by a treaty. So that could be one of your options. Sorry, and you don't need to go into that background about the Senkaku Islands. I wouldn't be looking for that in this answer, because those are all the sorts of details that I'm not expecting people to remember. But how can international disputes like this be resolved? Well, treaty is one. Japan and China could enter into negotiations and, divide them 50-50 each. So that... Is there anything that you could say that shows, critical insight into that sort of solution?
It's unlikely.
It's unlikely. Why?
Why is it unlikely? Because
No one wants to concede.
concede anything.
Yeah.
Everyone wants-
There's this big political... Japan and China have been fighting each other for centuries. Little invasions and wars and the like. And there's this huge domestic politics around, negotiations or relationships with the opposing countries. So neither wants to step back. So treaty is an option, but what else could they do to resolve it peacefully? So if you have a dispute and you can't come up with a treaty, you could, you could submit it to some international forum to be resolved according to international law. Sorry, a treaty too, you could, a treaty could involve basically payment as well, so one could buy it. But, like when Russia sold Alaska to the US, there was a treaty effectively or an agreement, an international agreement about the transfer of sovereignty, and the US paid money for it. But
You need to own something before you can sell it.
yeah, but if the two parties are disputing who owns it, and one says, well, I'll give you, $1 billion yen, for it, and the other says, oh, well, actually, that's enough. We give up any claim to sovereignty based on them paying us money for it. But that's still essentially settled by negotiation, by a treaty, some form of agreement. You could submit it to arbitration. So what are the sorts of forums that it might go to?
International Court of Justice.
Could, yeah, or some international... They could each appoint, 3 arbitrators. So you can come up with your own arbitration. Again, is that likely? Why haven't they already done that? I mean, they've been disputing this for years. Well, one thing with this is, again, details you don't need to go into, but my view is Japan has a far better legal claim. So China will never agree to submit it to an international forum because it'll probably lose. Similar to the South China Sea, China's never going to submit that to an international forum because its legal claim is really weak. So if you can't be forced to submit it to an arbitration, you only would submit it if you were quite confident of winning. And yeah. So, international treaty, arbitration by an international forum, other ways that countries can resolve international disputes. There's 2 that the US is using a lot of at the moment. economic sanctions is something that is still widely used, and also what is still fairly widely used, even though it's outlawed under the UN Charter? Force, yeah. So they could have a war over it. So how could this be resolved? War. Not that anyone wants that, but there have been huge concerns. Like a decade ago, the Senkaku Islands really looked like there was going to be at least a small-scale war between Japan and China over it. Yeah, so the international community, if there was a war over it, what could the international community do about it? I mean, apart from take sides.
Then you can't sanction China really.
Yeah, well, you can sanction China. I mean, the US is doing lots of economic sanctions at the moment. Yeah, but it could go like the Security Council could pass a resolution about this, couldn't they? Do you think they could?
No, because
China has veto power, so there'll never be a UN Security Council resolution about the Senkaku Islands, because China would never agree if it's contrary to its interests, and the US would never agree if it's contrary to Japan's interests, because Japan is an ally. So, yeah. So we're at an impasse. And in terms of any major international institutions that may be involved in resolving such disputes and their role? So what are the sorts of ones we've talked about? So we've already mentioned the ICJ, International Court of Justice. That's for a forum. What about the UN? What about the UN generally? Are they ever involved in resolving these sorts of disputes? Or disputes, that might lead to war?
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
So the UN could be involved. So when we talk about the UN there, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the General Assembly? Are we talking about the Security Council? Are we talking about, say, just the Secretary General and the executive within the, like the Secretariat? The Secretary General is the sort of thing, that could play a role in, trying to lead them, look for negotiations and the like. Okay, happy with that? So, yeah, you can, many different ways. It's a small, it's a short answer, but you can basically, talk about treaties, talk about, armed conflict, economic sanctions, mention the ICJ, the UN. Those are the sorts of things they'd be looking for, and really just showing your understanding of fundamental concepts. Cool. Okay, moving on. Medium length answers. 4 questions worth 6 marks each, so about 16 minutes to answer these. The Republic of Palau. Palau often comes up in exams in this course. I've never been to Palau. Has anyone ever seen pictures of it? It's the most amazing little place, this little island nation with incredible beauty. It's got this famous jellyfish lake, where there's this lake that's been essentially cut off from the oceans for ages, and it's got like tens of thousands of jellyfish in the lake, and people can go swimming there and the like. And yeah, it's an incredible country, a member of AOSIS. Just recently I saw in the news that they banned sunscreen from certain types of sunscreen because there's sunscreens that are really toxic for corals and the like. So they've banned them. So they're very outspoken on international environment issues and coral reefs and the like. Okay, so the Republic of Palau, a tiny Pacific nation, is struggling to manage its fisheries sustainably, particularly due to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing by high-tech foreign vessels that enter Palau's maritime waters. Palau is a party to UNCLOS. In this context, explain the major maritime boundaries established under UNCLOS and what a coastal state such as Palau can regulate within its maritime zones. B, explain what is meant by the high seas and what a state can regulate in this area, either under UNCLOS or under customary international law. And 3, critically evaluate the statement that UNCLOS is good at regulating fishing within national waters but poor at regulating fishing on the high seas. Okay, so 3 parts to this. So what are the major maritime boundaries for A? Yep.
The EEZ is the big one.
Yep.
That's up to 200 nautical miles.
Yep.
And it's a continental shelf.
Yeah. So within the EEZ,
That's where you can regulate fishing
yes.
and mining exploration. So you've got control of the sea floor or whatever as well. And then the continental shelf, you can't control fisheries in that area.
Yeah, so the big ones I'd be looking for you to mention are don't worry about the inner ones, like the there's a number of sort of steps out, sort of the territorial sea, contiguous zone, particularly. There's coastal waters, which are 3 nautical miles, territorial sea, contiguous zone. All of those aren't important for us because they're really about customs and what so you get increasing rights to inspect things within those areas. But the big one for environment is the EEZ, out to 200 nautical miles. And within that, you can basically control fishing, oil and gas, everything, including in the water column above the seafloor. So you can control activities like drilling in the seafloor and extraction from the seafloor, but you can control fishing within the water column as well. And then if you go out onto the continental shelf, so in the continental shelf, what can you control?
You can't control the water column. It's
Yep.
just things that happen on the sea.
Yeah, particularly oil and gas.
You need
Yeah.
to submit it to the commission, though, to establish rights.
Oh, that's really just to, you can, basically there were requirements for setting out where the continental shelf is, because like if you look here around, say Tasmania, those blue areas are areas that Australia has identified a continental shelf because it's a physical feature and it doesn't extend out, you know, at an exact distance at every location. So the treaty required countries to basically do their homework and then submit what they say are their continental shelves, you know, with the relevant scientific surveying data. So that's why when you look at a map like this, the continental shelf, for instance, here off southwest Australia, obviously is less than 200 nautical miles because there's no claim for a continental shelf outside that area. So in that sort of situation, Australia can't, this area here, the light blue, are the high seas. But this area south of Tasmania, it's a continental shelf area, but still Australia, can it control, say, a Japanese vessel is fishing there? Can it be controlled? No, unless... When can it be controlled? By an Australian vessel. Or, well, in that area, what can, say in this area, on the effectively the high seas, what can an Australian Coast Guard vessel or naval vessel do to a ship that's flagged somewhere in the world? So, well, that's not well asked. If a naval vessel comes across a fishing vessel, and on the naval vessel they often carry Australian fishing officers as well. So there's a vessel here, so it's on the high seas, and it comes across a fishing vessel. What can essentially the Australian fishing officers do?
Australia can regulate the activities of citizens and registered vessels.
Yep, so if a vessel is flagged, if it's an Australian flagged vessel, they could go on board and inspect it. So if it's a fishing vessel from Australia, they can go on board and inspect it. Anywhere in the world. Also Australian citizens, but then it's hard because if it's not flagged in Australia, then you don't necessarily have a right to board it to start with. But technically, yeah, we can regulate citizens. So one of the rare examples the sorts of things that Australia regulates globally are things like terrorist activities, or if you go to, so those people that went to Syria to fight, they've range of things that we can regulate because they're Australian citizens. We regulate whaling, so you can't go to Alaska and kill a whale. You as an Australian citizen, if you did that, you'd be in breach of Australian law. But if it's flagged, the vessel there is flagged in Japan, what can Australia do? Can it board it? No. Unless
they started hot pursuit or...
Yep, within territory, but let's just say they haven't started hot pursuit. They could do it if there's an agreement. So, for instance, if it was, a vessel was part of the tuna fishery, Australia and Japan have, say, given each other reciprocal rights to inspect vessels. So, in that case, they could do it. Okay, so EEZ continental shelf. Explain what they cover. Yeah, EEZ is particularly important. So the high seas means what? Yeah. Yep. I think if you looked at that handout. No. Yeah, the high seas is effectively the water column, even if it's above the continental shelf. So above the continental shelf, countries can't regulate the fishing in the water column, called essentially pelagic fishery, because there's I think demersal fisheries are essentially where you drag something along the bottom, but anything in the water column, swimming above the ocean floor, you can't regulate, but they can regulate drilling on the seafloor. Okay. So critically, yep.
So the question about that diagram, are the high seas always on top of the continental shelf?
So the continental shelf might, like here, the continental shelf, in this diagram goes out to that point. But, the continental shelf could end, within the 200 nautical miles. So not necessarily, like the high seas might, be above, like in the diagram here. This is the high seas, and there's no continental shelf in that location. Cool? So don't get too worried about the continental shelf. I think it's useful to see it in sort of this diagram from the side, and then I find it personally really useful to look at a real map like this and then think about what it means in reality. That's why I gave it to you on a handout. But the main thing to be aware of is the EEZ, because it's so critically important for fisheries management. So the statement is, UNCLOS is good at managing fisheries within, but poor at managing them out. Critically evaluate it. Well, is it correct?
Partially.
Yep.
Legally, yes, it is quite good for establishing sovereign development within territorial waters.
Yep.
But in practice, we've got issues of illegal fishing.
Great. Like that's a great answer showing real insight, and it's not just a mechanical answer. So that shows real insight. Partially, yeah. I think broadly the answer to that is yes. You could say yes, it's on paper, but for a country like Australia that has essentially a well-regulated, and high-tech surveillance capability, it's really quite strong. Obviously, up here in northern Australia, it's really difficult because there's a lot of illegal fishing activity coming across from Indonesia, particularly, and the vessels are small. Palau, particularly, I think I mentioned a documentary where it was a foreign correspondent documentary on Palau and illegal fishing. Australia has given a patrol vessel to Palau, but they've only got one, and the vessels that are now coming out of Korea and China that are operating illegally in waters. They're high tech. They've got good radar. They're fast. You've got to begin, hop shoot within. You've got to have basically a visual. You can't just like identify them on radar and then go after them. You've actually.
Likely to change. It's like foreign technology to do that.
Is it likely to change? What do you think are the obstacles to that changing? Because it's abundantly bloody obvious that it should be changed. Because, like UNCLOS was written in the 80s, and obviously the technology has changed massively since then. Why haven't they updated it?
Because there's certain countries that are very careful that we keep fishing.
Yep.
down the
And we faced the problem that was, I talked about the Bering fur seals arbitration back in the 1890s, and it basically, the arbitration said, there should be a closed season, and it was an arbitration between the US and Britain and Canada, part of the British territory at the time, and they said there should be a closed season, there should be a flag vessel, there should be a registration of captains, there should be catch limits, there should be all of these things. And the two countries then imposed that, but then what happened to all of the vessels that were registered in the US and Canada? They all changed their flags to Russia and Japan and basically avoided the regulations. So that's the problem, that essentially countries can avoid it by just basically changing their flag. And yeah, so it's a huge, huge problem. Why can't a country like in a sense, like there could be a country that isn't a party to UNCLOS. Like let's just say Zimbabwe, or like a small country, let's just say, I don't know, North Korea. I don't know if they're actually I'll go with Zimbabwe because no one wants to be even touch North Korea. Like if you're a company, you're not going to go and register in North Korea because it's just would be toxic. But let's just say you can flag in Zimbabwe and they've got no controls at all on fishing, and they don't recognize, if they didn't recognise UNCLOS, how can essentially UNCLOS be enforced? Can it be enforced against them? Technically not, but in practice, because it's now become so widely adopted, most countries would simply say, this is international law. So it could be potentially extended out. The global community could simply just say the high seas are going to be effectively regulated, collaboratively. There's going to be a uniform code of practice and catch limits allocated, based on population maybe. But what would be the obstacle to that? Monitoring enforcement is a big practical issue, but there are some big countries that are actually quite happy to allow their ships to go and effectively, mass pillage, yeah. So, and those countries are, well, Russia, but now China has got the world's biggest, basically offshore fleet by multiple government subsidised. It is just a huge, huge problem. So, and China just doesn't want to. It wants to basically feed its population and basically get these resources. So they're not agreeing to. So they're a huge problem. And Russia particularly, and China are huge problems. Okay. So, critical evaluate. You can talk about that, show your insight into it, but basically at the end of 16 minutes, move on. Cool. Okay. In 2015, the UN General Assembly adopted by resolution the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. One of the targets of Goal 14 is by 2020 conserve at least 10% of coastal and marine areas consistent with national and international law and based on the best available scientific information. Explain whether the SDGs and their associated targets are legally binding on all members of the UN because they're a resolution of the General Assembly. B, if a country fails to meet the targets, what are the consequences? C, what is the role and importance of the SDGs and similar resolutions by the General Assembly for international, national environmental regulation and policy? Okay, A, hit me with it. Are they legally binding, are members of the UN? No? Why? Why not?
Because they're made by the General Assembly and then there's recommendations.
Yeah, they're not binding, and what's a big principle that is really fundamental to international regulation, talked about a lot, gave you a hand about it, starts with S, sovereignty. So sovereignty is a big thing that countries are jealous of. That's what is sovereignty?
The right to enact laws and that,
Yeah, effectively right to control activities within your own territory. Recognised right to control. Recognition, it's quite a slippery term to identify. It's a little bit like silver, it sort of moves around. But yeah, it's the power and right to control. So Australia has sovereignty over, the Australian government. When we say Australia, we're talking about the government of Australia has sovereignty over this country. Obviously, we gained it, we conquered the Aboriginal people that were here. So it was gained by conquest, and now we have sovereignty. And countries are typically jealously guard their sovereignty. They don't like to agree to give up power and be controlled by other people. So the UN General Assembly is not a international parliament that can make laws that are binding on the whole the whole world. So countries have not given the UN that right. So if, say, a country fails to meet this, and you could weave in the facts a bit, like if a country fails to meet this target of 10% by 2020, what's the consequence? Yeah, so there's no legal consequence. But what's the role? Well, I said there's no legal consequences, but
international pride.
yeah, international pride.
Condemnation as well.
Yep. Potentially. So what's the role of these? If they're not binding, what's the point? Why have them?
It's still a sort of guidance measure.
Yep.
And they still have quite strong influence on other international.
Great. They are still influential. Countries generally want to be seen as good international citizens. So Australia, took a big hit at the latest Conference of the Parties because it was seen to be, along with Brazil and the US, seen to be one of the key countries blocking any progress. So, and also what was the other big thing that happened at the COP that Australia got a lot of flack about, apart from just basically being a spoiler? What was the other big thing? Carryover credits, yeah. So we basically cheated the system for the Kyoto Protocol and got a really weak target and a really strong baseline. So we ended up meeting our targets by cheating, basically. And now we want to use the results we got by cheating. The world's facing this dire situation, and Australia, being one of the richest, one of the most polluting per capita countries, still wants to use its cheat from 20 years ago, and frankly a lot of countries are just sick of it and basically don't want Australia to be able to cheat the system anymore. So yeah, we've taken a big hit to our credibility. And there's the time too, sorry, I've gone past the hour, but should we just keep going? We're just about to wrap up. Okay, so yeah, international pride, but also there's positive. It isn't just a negative. There's actually good. One of the big things with this SDGs is they're actually a package of trying to be, the green growth sort of idea that they're dealing with poverty, hunger, social development, education, clean water. Yeah, so it's an integrated approach. And they're all things that countries often want to achieve anyway. So as I said, I tried to make this point really strongly when we talked about World Heritage. Like the Great Wall of China, for instance, I use that as the example, that China would have wanted to protect the Great Wall of China anyway, because it is, you know, really important to its culture. It's very proud of it. So a lot of the properties that have been listed or countries have put forward, they already were highly protected under the national laws already, and countries are proud of them, want to protect that culture and that heritage. So by listing them, they get the international recognition, but they don't really give up any development rights. So similarly with Australia, a lot of our Australia World Heritage Area, they were fully protected already, and we just basically grouped them together and put them forward as a, you know, this World Heritage Area. And that's great, but we didn't give up anything really. So similarly with the SDGs, what's their role? Yes, they're great guidance internationally, but they're also going to be largely consistent with what most countries want to do anyway. So by a country achieving, for instance, improving education levels or achieving, you know, better clean water for its citizens, it's not like it suffered anything. It's actually a good thing. So its guidance, countries can, you know, progress in them is actually good progress for the country. So, cool. Okay. 6. The Australian government has enacted the Illegal Logging Prohibition Act 2012 to prohibit the importation of illegally logged timber and timber products such as paper into Australia and the processing of illegally logged Australian raw logs. So this is a real act. As I said, I like to have real facts. So that's actually what it does. The Act does not directly prohibit any timber or timber products being imported. Rather, the Act requires importers of regulated timber products and processors of Australian raw logs to conduct due diligence in order to reduce the risk that illegally logged timber is imported or processed. And the Australian government is investigating whether timber that has been illegally logged in PNG is being processed in the People's Republic of China, then imported into Australia as timber products in contravention of the Act. Advise the Chinese government of whether the Act is lawful under international trade law. In your answer, explain the source of the trade laws and the principles that will be applied to determine whether such restrictions are lawful. Assume that China and Australia are parties to any relevant treaty. So the first part is true. We do have that Act. These facts came from essentially the work I'm doing in PNG and the fact that there's a lot of illegal logging. It goes to China and then it's basically sold, particularly as flooring products and all sorts of stuff. If you walk into Bunnings and buy, you know, some timber, then, you know, anyway. But I thought the Act is really interesting, and that's why I put it in this question. You don't need to know anything more than's in the question. So I mentioned this in the lectures, but you don't need to know anything about it. You don't need to go and look at it. And this sort of question, I'll give you enough to answer it as long as you understand what. This question is about illegal logging, is it? Or it's about trade. So what's the treaty that we've looked at? General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And what was the article that we looked at particularly?
20.
Article 20, yep. And what are the two words? I'd be really looking forward to you. Arbitrary and discriminatory, two key words. Okay, so in answering this, you might say, you know, there is a question on trade in the exam, and I'm really looking for you to show that you understand the basic principles. It's easy to get, you know, 3 marks out of 6 here, and then I'm really looking for you to apply and reach some good conclusions and show insight into them. So you could have a stock standard beginning to this answer that to say, you know, the major international, or there's many international trade laws, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, brackets GATT, you know, is updated and expanded in 1994 to establish the World Trade Organization. It is a core component of the international trade system. What's the emphasis in GATT? The emphasis is on unrestricted trade or removing barriers to trade. I personally try and avoid the word free trade because it's actually not about free trade. Free trade is one of those euphemisms that we use that, you know, no one can really object to free trade, but it's you know, like if you, yeah, it's about removing restrictions to trade. Restrictions on trade to protect the environment, but what's the core thing? We've already mentioned the two words, but as long as they are not arbitrary or discriminatory, yeah, contrary to Article 20. So I don't generally want you to remember the numbers of articles. I think this is a worthwhile one because it's just Article 20, normally written as two X's in the sort of Roman style. So under Article 20, and then a brief explanation about what those two things mean. So what is discriminatory?
The point is not to sort of differentiate between domestic and
Yeah, the key one in discrimination is where you put stronger restrictions on goods produced overseas to goods produced domestically. So effectively, you're giving you're making it easier and cheaper for your domestic producers, and you're restricting overseas producers. So that's your classic discrimination. You treat essentially the same product differently depending on where it comes from. And what is arbitrary?
Isn't it like the response to whatever you're trying to prevent is considered kind of fair or no?
Yeah, close. You're getting there. The concept of arbitrary is really complex and it becomes really technical really quickly. I'd suggest it to you to go and have a read of some of the summaries of the big cases about the UN tuna case, shrimp tuna, dolphin tuna cases. There's any, like the textbook that I've given you that's online has like a little brief description of them. They become really technical really quickly. So to summarise,
the acting of those has to respond directly to the environmental impacts.
yep. So there's some proportional, it's got to be proportional or a reasonable response to the threat or the problem you're trying to deal with, and also flexibility is another core part of it. So it's proportional to the issue, as well as flexible to allow for differences in different sources to be addressed. So for instance, a complete ban on say palm oil,
because there is some palm oil that's produced sustainably.
yeah, so if Australia had a complete ban on palm oil, whether produced domestically or internationally, on its face, it doesn't look discriminatory because it applies, but in terms of not being arbitrary, it's really hard to justify that in that there's no flexibility built into it. So even though it's technical, one of the things I really emphasise to you is if a country does something that's consistent with a major multilateral treaty like CITES, then it's more likely to pass GATT than if it does something unilaterally. So if it's the only country doing something, then it becomes harder to justify. But if there's a broad consensus to deal with something like CITES and bans on, for instance, ivory, then that's easier to justify or more likely to survive an attack in GATT. But flexibility is one of the key things with not being arbitrary as well. Okay, so then let's try and apply those sorts of things to the facts here. So let's look at discrimination. Do we see anything about discrimination here?
No, because it applies to import timber and to timber processed in Australia.
Yes. So how would you write that? How would you include that sort of conclusion? That's great reasoning. So we've set out some of the principles. Now let's look for, is this discriminatory? And on its face, it's not. So come to that conclusion. So say, on the facts given here, the Act regulates both imports as well as domestically produced timber. So even though it, and on the facts you're given here, there's no discriminatory, no discrimination apparent. I mean, the fact that it talks, there's in two parts. It deals with imported of illegally logged timber as well as goods in Australia. Well, it has to do those two aspects to be able to regulate, imports as well as domestic production. If it only dealt with imports, then that would be discriminatory. And similarly here in the second part, the Act requires importers of regulated timber products and processors of Australian raw logs to conduct due diligence. So it's requiring both international source timber as well as domestically produced timber to do the same thing. So we give it a tick for not being discriminatory. So reach that conclusion, come to a clear conclusion. So this is really attractive for me when I'm reading it. It shows that you understand the principles, and given in the context of the pressure of an exam where you've only got 16 minutes, I'm impressed that you can apply something and reach a conclusion. So here, and it shows that you're not just copying down your notes because it's something that you had to do in the exam, so I can give you lots of marks for it. So come to a clear conclusion. Here, that doesn't appear to be discriminatory. Okay, in terms of arbitrary,
Well, it doesn't actually ban the sale or importation of
mm-hmm.
it just applies restrictions, so no one would be arbitrary either.
That's a great answer. I'm actually really impressed by this Illegal Logging Prohibition Act because it's really gotten around. You can see it's really been written to avoid the arbitrary problem. It basically places the onus on the producers or the importers to do due diligence. So can you see how that's flexible? Like you're giving them principles about what they've got to do, but you're not telling them what they've got to do, and you're not like just banning all timber from Papua New Guinea or banning all timber from Borneo. You're basically requiring the companies that are importing them to check. And so there's flexibility inherently built into the system. So I think it's a really smart approach, at least for giving you us feeling good that we're doing something. The reality is it's very difficult to, make a difference in this sphere, and there's so much timber and so much illegality. But on the facts here, it looks okay. I mean, they become really technical and you don't have all of the facts. You could say that, but on the facts you're given here, it seems to be a system that allows for flexibility and seems proportionate to the issues. Cool. Okay, so that's that. So just be able to talk about GATT, talk about arbitrary and discriminatory, set out what they are, and then apply them to the facts to reach a conclusion. Okay, question 7. On 26 December 2018, the Government of Japan gave a formal notice of withdrawal from the Whaling Convention. On the same day, Japan announced its intention to resume commercial whaling. Once Japan is not a party to the convention, it will no longer be bound by the ban on commercial whaling for parties to the convention. Article 11 of the convention provides, I've set out the text, advise the Government of Japan on when is the first day Japan can lawfully carry out commercial whaling according to the normal principles for treaty interpretation. Upon its withdrawal from the treaty taking effect, are there any limits on where Japan can carry out commercial whaling around the globe? C, what measures, if any, can the Government of Australia and other governments opposed to commercial whaling take to respond to Japan's withdrawal and resumption of commercial whaling? Okay, so a bit to this, but start with, it's about treaty interpretation, isn't it? Giving you a bit of it. So you can answer any of these questions about treaty interpretation by simply setting out the principles and quoting from, Article 31 of the Vienna Convention. And what's the core principle? You interpret a treaty in accordance with good faith and the ordinary meaning, read in context. So basically, don't be tricky. So, and mostly treaties should be really clear on what they mean. So Any contracting party may withdraw from the convention on the 30th of June of any year by giving notice on or before the 1st of January in the same year to the depository government, which upon receipt of such a notice shall at once communicate to the other contracting parties. The convention shall cease to be in force on the 30th of June of that same year with respect to the government giving such notice of withdrawal. So it has to give notice by the 1st of January.
Which is done.
Yep. So if we look at the facts, on 26 December 2018, the government of Japan gave a formal notice. So that's by the 1st of January 2018. So when does the withdrawal take effect?
I wasn't quite sure whether, is it the 30th of June 2019 or the 1st of July? I read that as the 30th of June.
I personally would not be upset about the 30th or the 1st. That's like, doesn't really matter about the exact day. Yeah, I would go with the 30th of June. So basically, the first second of the 30th of June, like midnight, 1 second on, it no longer applies. In law, we often get around, what is the actual date that something ceases to have effect and whether it includes the day or doesn't include the day.
So just 2019 or 2018?
Well, it has to be 2019, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It doesn't.
Because it says within the year, but it's like I was a little bit confused by the dates. It said on the 26th of December, give notice on before 1st of January. The same.
Giving notice on or before the 1st of January of the same year. I read it as forward. I'm not particularly concerned if you gave me an explanation that it's not clear whether it's that year or not. I would be happy in the exam that you were even able to say something sensible like that. So don't be stressed about is that, yeah. And they can't go backward anyway.
Yeah.
You can't go backwards in time, so the proactive. So yeah, 1st of January you give notice and then it ceases to apply in essentially that same year of the 1st of January, so that year coming forward. So that then the first day that they can, so set out the principles that, under Article 31 of the Vienna Convention, law of treaties, a treaty is interpreted according to good faith and ordinary meaning, read in context. Here, the text is clear that as Japan gave notice on the 30th of December 2018, then they gave it before the 1st of January of 2019. Therefore, they can, the first day they can lawfully carry out commercial whaling is the 30th of June 2019. If you said 1 July, I don't mind. Upon its withdrawal from, is everyone happy with that? So pretty simple. Simple set of facts, a little bit of a treaty, apply the principles, easy marks. Upon its withdrawal from the convention taking effect, are there any limits on where Japan can carry out commercial whaling around the globe? What are they?
Only within its own territory or its own EEZ.
Yep, not quite.
They couldn't have commercial whaling on other countries' EEZs.
That's right. What about the high seas? Yep. Just basically not in other countries' maritime zones if those countries ban whaling. So Australia has declared a whale sanctuary in its entire EEZ, which was in the court case that I was involved in. The key thing we were saying is, well, Australian law recognises a whale sanctuary around Australia's Antarctic waters. You're an Australian court, you have to recognise Australian waters, even though Japan doesn't. And we won on that basic point. So, happy with that?
I know it's like nitpicking a little bit, but what if they negotiated fishing rights with another country?
If you were to set that down in your answer, that's fine. I'm happy to give you marks for insight. You're showing insight there, and in the pressure of an exam. So I'm not expecting you to do that. With this question, you can see it's one of the last questions in it, so I've given away a lot of easy marks so people can easily pass, and now I'm just really looking for a little bit of mix and match as well. There's a bit of treaty interpretation. It's about whaling, but then there's also something about UNCLOS in it, so basically just showing that you're showing that you can actually think about just not things in boxes, but actually, it's about whaling. They're not part of the Whaling Convention, but there's still restrictions on fisheries in maritime zones under UNCLOS, so they can be restricted. You could say, unless they negotiate a treaty. Yep.
Could they, I'm sorry, I'm more curious, could they actually negotiate fishing rights with a country that was a signatory to the Whaling Convention? I know they shouldn't.
I would think that country would be bound by the Whaling Convention and the ban on commercial whaling. So I think for that sort of country, they would have a problem. But if they're like the small South Pacific countries that are paid by Japan, were paid by Japan to go to the sort of meetings, if I was that country and I wanted to give whaling rights, what could they do? Withdraw from the convention too. So if Tonga wants to basically allow Japan to come in and whale in its waters, it just withdraws from the convention. It's no longer bound by it, and it can authorise it. So C, what measures, if any, can the Government of Australia and other governments opposed to commercial whaling take to respond to Japan's withdrawal from the convention and resumption of commercial whaling? Yep, so they can still ban whaling in their waters. Yep, so that's a good measure. What's another thing they could do? Sanctions is something you could do. You can ban also their imports. Ban imports of... Sorry?
You could help facilitate a treaty on the high seas.
Yeah.
Sorry, as in ban their imports of the product.
Yep, of whale meat.
Yeah.
Yep.
TST.
Well, then, because it's part of the international treaty, the Whaling Convention, that's broadly recognised, I think you could get away with that, in that it's, more likely to survive if it's part of a, broad treaty. But I can see issues for GATT about it being just arbitrary if you just ban it, particularly if the whale meat that they're whaling is not endangered, then it's pretty hard to justify under GATT. I think you'd get away with it though. Okay. So a range of things we could do.
Is it possible that you could ban whaling altogether in another treaty, or would that be too extreme?
The hard thing is that, again, the same problem that we face with fisheries conventions is the countries that don't want to be bound by it don't sign up. You can't force them to. And then you fall back to the old problem of on the high seas, that if a vessel is not registered in your country, you can't just go on board and enforce your laws against it. So we come back to the same problem that's been occurring for a century, from the Bering fur seals arbitration problem. That's the recurring problem of high seas fisheries, or fisheries management generally, is the ability to avoid it by just registering. The fleet then, the vessels re-register in countries to avoid the regulations. So it's hard.
Could you then ban whaling equipment or ships?
Yeah, potentially, but Japan can manufacture all of those things themselves. So what's going to be effective? It's hard. Okay, so that was the exam. We've come back to the essay. Everyone pretty happy? Okay, so I emphasise there's some questions that have got some fundamental concepts, a little bit about the UN, treaty interpretation, process for negotiating and creating treaties. All of these same issues will be on this year's exam. So you guys are well prepared now with the couple of tutorials we've had. You will go in and there won't be anything that's a surprise to you. So all of these sorts of issues are the same sorts of things you'll face in this year's exam. Cool? Any questions generally? No? Okay, well, let's wrap up. I thought we'd finish earlier than this, but it's taken us 2 hours. Anyway, I hope you feel now confident. You can go into the exam. As I said, there's no surprises. Go in, show us, you know, how smart you are. Really looking to give you lots of marks. Thanks, everyone. Yep, I'll just stop there.